In a quiet, suburban neighborhood, a story of betrayal and revenge is about to unfold. When Eleanor Thompson discovered her bank account emptied and her cherished family home sold without her knowledge, she thought her world had ended. Her own grandchild, whom she had loved and supported for decades, had stolen everything she had spent a lifetime building. They assumed she would quietly accept defeat, broken and helpless like so many elderly victims before her. They were about to learn how wrong they were. This isn't just another tragic tale of elder abuse. This is the story of how a grandmother, stripped of everything but her dignity, would prove that the wisdom of age is sharper than the greed of youth. When they took her home and savings, they didn't realize they were awakening a force that would turn their perfect crime into their worst nightmare. What follows is the account of how one woman, armed with nothing but her wit and determination, would orchestrate a revenge so brilliant that it would shake her family to its core and prove that underestimating a grandmother might be the last mistake her grandchild ever makes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The vintage grandfather clock in Eleanor Thompson's living room had marked every precious moment of her life for the past 40 years. Its steady ticking echoed through the Victorian home she had purchased with her late husband Howard back in 1983, each second a reminder of the careful planning and sacrifices that had built their modest but comfortable life. Eleanor wasn't born into wealth. She had worked as a high school English teacher for 35 years, saving every extra penny while raising 3 children. Howard's job as a postal worker meant they lived modestly, but they always made sure their children never went without. Their small Victorian house in the older part of town became their sanctuary, its wraparound porch hosting countless family gatherings and summer evening discussions. Among all her grandchildren, Alex had always been special. From the moment they first laid eyes on each other in the hospital 28 years ago, Eleanor felt a connection that went beyond the usual grandmother-grandchild bond. Alex would spend weekends at her house while their parents worked extra shifts, sitting on the kitchen counter while Eleanor baked her famous snickerdoodle cookies, asking endless questions about her life stories. As Alex grew, Eleanor's pride grew with them. She attended every school play, every soccer game, and every graduation. When Alex showed interest in business during high school, Eleanor dipped into her carefully managed savings to pay for extra tutoring. Investment in education is the best investment you can make, she would say, beaming with pride as Alex's grades improved. Every Wednesday afternoon, Eleanor hosted her bridge club in the sun-drenched conservatory she and Howard had added to. The house in 95. Martha, Regina, and Dorothy had been her closest friends for over 2 decades, their weekly games more about friendship than cards. They had supported each other through the loss of husbands, health scares, and family dramas. Their sharp minds and sharper tongues kept Eleanor young at heart, even as her hair turned silver and laugh lines deepened around her eyes. "You spoil that child too much," Martha would often say, watching Eleanor write another check for Alex's college textbooks or car repairs. But Eleanor would just smile, remembering how her own grandmother had scraped together pennies to help her through college. "Sometimes love means sacrifice," she would reply, tucking away the checkbook in her worn leather purse. The first signs were subtle. Alex's visits became less frequent, phone calls shorter. Eleanor attributed it to the natural busy life of a young professional. But then came the questions about her finances, casual at first. "Grandma, have you thought about investing your savings? The market's really good right now. Or, this old house must be worth a fortune with property values going up." Eleanor noticed changes in Alex's appearance too. Designer clothes, a fancy new car, expensive watches. "Business is going really well," they would say when she commented. She felt pride, thinking her grandchild was succeeding through hard work, just as she had taught them. The thought that her own sacrifices might have planted seeds of greed never crossed her mind. The bridge ladies saw it differently. Dorothy, who had worked in a bank for 40 years before retiring, would purse her lips whenever Alex's name came up. "Something's not right about that one anymore," she would mutter, but Eleanor defended her grandchild fiercely. After all, she had raised Alex better than that, hadn't she? Looking back, Eleanor would remember these days with a mixture of love and regret. The carefully maintained home, the meticulously balanced checkbook, the trust she had built over decades. All of it was about to become weapons in a war she never expected to fight. But for now, she sat in her favorite armchair, watching the sunset paint golden streaks across her hardwood floors, blissfully unaware that her life of careful sacrifice was about to be shattered by the very person she had sacrificed everything for. Retirement suited Eleanor Thompson. Her days fell into a comfortable rhythm that she had crafted with the same careful attention she'd given to her lesson plans during her teaching years. Every morning began with a cup of Earl Grey tea on her porch, watching the neighborhood come to life as joggers passed and children waited for school buses. Mrs. Chen, her neighbor of 15 years, would often wave from her garden, their shared love of roses creating a friendship that bloomed alongside. Their flowers, the Methodist church 2 blocks away, had become her second home since Howard's passing. She taught Sunday school, coordinated bake sales, and chaired the community outreach committee. The children called her Grandma Ellie, and she kept a jar of butterscotch candies in her purse just for them. "You remind me so much of my Alex. At that age," she'd say, her eyes twinkling as she handed out treats. Her financial routine was equally well ordered. Bills were paid the day they arrived, balanced against her teacher's pension and Howard's life insurance investments. She maintained 3 accounts, checking for monthly expenses, savings for emergencies, and a special high-interest account she called her legacy fund, money she planned to leave to her grandchildren someday. Alex's increased attention to her finances began innocently enough. "Grandma, these bank fees are ridiculous. I know a better bank," they'd say during their now monthly visits. "Let me help you set up online banking. It's so much easier." Eleanor hesitated. She liked her paper statements and writing checks. But Alex insisted it was time to modernize. The weekly calls from Alex became more focused on money matters. "The stock market's booming, Grandma. Your savings are just sitting there, losing value to inflation." They'd send her articles about investment opportunities, stories about elderly people who'd lost everything by being too conservative with their money. The pressure was gentle but persistent. Mrs. Chen noticed the changes first. "Eleanor, your grandchild seems very interested in your business lately," she observed one afternoon as they pruned roses together. "My own mother lost everything to a scammer in Taiwan. Family isn't always family when money is involved." But Eleanor dismissed her concerns with a wave. "Alex is different. They've always been my special one." Small irregularities began appearing in her accounts. A missing statement here, an unexplained V there. When she called the bank, Alex had already been there. "Your grandson stopped by to handle it," the teller would say, though Eleanor couldn't remember giving permission for that. Her bridge club noticed her growing distraction during their weekly games. "You've trumped your own ace twice today," Dorothy pointed out one Wednesday. "Is everything all right?" Eleanor brushed off their concerns, but the ladies exchanged knowing looks. They'd all seen too many stories on the news about elderly financial abuse to stay quiet. The final months of Eleanor's golden years passed in a blur of paperwork and promises. Alex brought documents for her to sign, always in a hurry, always, with an explanation that seemed just complicated enough to discourage questions. "It's just routine stuff, Grandma. Trust me, I'm protecting your interests." And she did trust them, with her whole heart and every careful signature. Her other children rarely visited anymore. "Alex says you're doing fine," they'd say when she called. "They're handling everything, right?" The distance grew, phone calls shortened, and Eleanor's world gradually shrank to her home, her garden, and her weekly bridge game. But even these constants were about to be torn away, though she didn't know it yet. Looking back, Eleanor would remember these as the last peaceful days of her retirement, the calm before a storm that would wash away everything she'd built, but also reveal strengths she never knew she had. For now, though, she simply sat in her garden, watching butterflies dance among her roses, unaware that her golden years were about to turn to lead. The autumn leaves were turning golden when Alex began bringing the lawyer to Eleanor's house. Mr. Peterson was a thin man, with wire-rimmed glasses and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He carried a sleek leather briefcase filled with what he called estate planning documents. Eleanor found herself sitting through long meetings where terms like power of attorney and living trust flew over her head like startled birds. "It's all standard procedure, Mrs. Thompson," Mr. Peterson would say, sliding another document across her antique coffee table. "Alex is just helping modernize your estate planning, making sure everything's protected." The word protected always came with a particular emphasis that made Eleanor's tea grow cold in its cup, untouched. Alex had changed in subtle ways that nagged at Eleanor's thoughts during sleepless nights. Their designer clothes carried price tags that made her teacher's heart skip a beat. A new Rolex gleamed on their wrist, and they'd traded their modest sedan for a Mercedes that looked out of place in her cramped driveway. "Business is booming," they'd say with a wave of their hand, dismissing her carefully worded concerns. The isolation grew like ivy up an old wall, gradual but persistent. Her other children, Michael and Sarah, called less frequently now. "Alex says you're not feeling well," they'd explain when she asked about their absence. "They told us you need rest, that too many visitors stress you out." Eleanor couldn't remember saying any such thing, but Alex spoke with such conviction that she began to doubt her own memory. Her bridge club dwindled as Alex scheduled more and more appointments during her usual Wednesday afternoons. "Grandma, the investment advisor can only meet on Wednesdays," they'd insist. "This is about securing your future." Dorothy tried to reschedule the games, but coordinating 4 elderly women's calendars proved impossible. Soon the cards lay untouched in their worn leather case, collecting dust alongside Eleanor's social life. Mrs. Chen watched from next door with growing concern. She'd lived in America for 40 years, but her Chinese mother's warnings about the importance of family harmony still echoed in her mind. Yet she also remembered her mother's other saying, harmony should not mask theft. One morning, over the fence between their gardens, she tried to warn Eleanor. "My friend's daughter did something similar," she began, but Eleanor cut her off with a forced smile. The shame of doubting her own grandchild was too heavy to bear. The documents kept coming: transfer papers, investment forms, property assessments. Alex always brought them at dusk, when Eleanor's eyes were tired and her mind was fuzzy from the day. They'd stand over her shoulder, pen ready, pointing to line after line that needed her signature. "It's just routine, Grandma. You trust me, right?" And she did trust them, even as her arthritic hand cramped from signing papers she couldn't quite focus on. The last red flag came in the form of a young real estate agent who appeared one day, measuring rooms and taking photos, just getting an insurance evaluation. Alex explained smoothly. "Property values have changed so much, we need to update your coverage." Eleanor noticed how the agent avoided meeting her eyes, how quickly they hurried through the house as if afraid questions might catch up to them. That night, Eleanor sat in Howard's old armchair, their wedding photo on the table beside her. "What would you do?" she whispered to his smiling face, but Howard had been gone for 5 years now, and the photo offered no answers. Outside, the autumn wind rattled dead leaves against the windows, a hollow sound that matched the growing emptiness. In her chest, she went to bed that night still trusting, still believing in the grandchild she had loved since birth. Tomorrow would bring the truth crashing down like a house of cards, but for now, Eleanor Thompson slept in her ancestral home. One last time, surrounded by memories she didn't yet know she would have to fight to keep. The morning that Eleanor's world shattered began like any other. She was enjoying her morning tea when her cell phone buzzed with a text message from her bank. "Unusual account activity detected," it read. Eleanor frowned. She hadn't made any transactions recently. With trembling fingers, she logged into her online banking, something Alex had insisted she learn to do. The numbers on the screen made no sense at first. Where her retirement savings should have shown 6 figures, there was barely enough to cover a month's groceries. Recent transactions showed massive transfers to accounts she didn't recognize, all authorized with her signature. Her heart began to race as she clicked through statement after statement, each one revealing more unauthorized transfers. Panic rising, Eleanor called the bank. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson," the manager said, "but these transfers were all properly authorized. Your grandson Alex brought in the paperwork himself. You signed everything." The manager's voice grew distant as Eleanor's vision blurred with tears. "And the house sale is already in processing." "House sale?" Eleanor's voice cracked. She hadn't sold her house. She would never sell her house. But there it was. Documentation of a sale, her signature on every page, the closing scheduled for next week. The room began to spin as she realized the true purpose of all those documents Alex had brought at dusk. All those papers she'd signed without reading properly. With shaking hands, she dialed Alex's number. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again and again. On the 4th try, a text message appeared. "Sorry, Grandma, but this is for the best. You're too old to manage such a large house anyway. I've arranged for a nice retirement home. You'll thank me later." Eleanor stumbled to her bathroom, barely making it in time to be sick. The cold tile pressed against her forehead as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Decades of savings, gone, her home sold from under her, all orchestrated by the grandchild she had loved and trusted more than anyone in the world. Mrs. Chen found her there an hour later, still huddled on the bathroom floor. The elderly Chinese woman took one look at Eleanor's face and knew. Without a word, she helped Eleanor to the kitchen and made fresh tea, adding a shot of brandy from a dusty bottle in the back of Eleanor's cupboard. "Tell me everything, Mrs. Chen said, her accent thickening with emotion as Eleanor poured out the whole terrible story. When Eleanor finished, Mrs. Chen's normally gentle face had hardened into granite. "This is not the end," she declared firmly. "This is the beginning. Now you fight." But as Eleanor looked around her beloved home, the walls lined with family photos, Howard's chair still angled toward her favorite spot on the sofa, the garden visible through windows that had witnessed 50 years of her life, she felt the weight of defeat crushing her chest. Everything she had built, everything she had saved, everything she had trusted in, had been stolen by the person she trusted most. The grandfather clock struck noon, its familiar chime now sounding like a death knell for the life she had known. Eleanor Thompson, who had spent 73 years building a legacy of love and trust, had just discovered that sometimes the deepest wounds come from the hands we least expect to hurt us. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of futile phone calls and mounting desperation. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by papers, her phone showing dozens of failed attempts to reach Alex. Each call to her other children ended the same way. "Alex says they're handling everything. You're just confused, Mom." The police station was worse. The young officer looked sympathetic but helpless as he reviewed her documents. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson, but these papers all have your legal signature. It's a civil matter." He slid a pamphlet across the desk. "Elder Services Resources," as if a glossy trifold could rebuild a shattered life. Mr. Peterson's law office wouldn't even let her pass the reception desk. "Mr. Peterson is unavailable," the receptionist said, not meeting Eleanor's eyes. "But he wants you to know that all transactions were completely legal and properly documented." The same words echoed at the bank, at the real estate office, everywhere she turned for help. The eviction notice arrived by certified mail, sterile and official. 30 days to vacate the premises. Eleanor's hands shook as she read it, remembering the day she and Howard had first walked through their front door. Now someone else would hang pictures on these walls, plant flowers in her garden, live the life she had built. That evening, scrolling through her phone in desperate search of help, Eleanor found Alex's Instagram page. There they were, posting photos from a luxury resort in Bali. "Living my best life," read the caption under a picture of Alex sipping champagne by an infinity pool. Eleanor's retirement savings sparkled on their wrist in the form of a new watch. It was too much. Eleanor felt something inside her snap, not like fragile china breaking, but like a steel cable pulling taut. She thought of her decades in the classroom, teaching children about consequences and justice. She thought of Howard, who had always said, "Sometimes you have to be your own hero." The grandfather clock struck midnight as Eleanor sat in Howard's chair. Her tears dried and her spine straight. Mrs. Chen's words echoed in her mind. This is not the end. No, it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something else entirely. Alex had taught high school physics. For every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Well, they were about to learn that lesson all over again. Eleanor reached for her phone one last time that night, but not to beg or plead. Instead, she called Dorothy from her bridge club. "Remember when you said something wasn't right about Alex? I need your help. And bring the others. It's time to play a different kind of game." As she hung up the phone, Eleanor felt something she hadn't expected to find at rock bottom. Purpose. They thought she would quietly disappear into a retirement home, another helpless elderly victim. But Eleanor Thompson had spent her life teaching others about justice, and now she was about to give her greatest lesson yet. Mrs. Chen's guest room wasn't large, but it offered. Eleanor stood up, walking to Mrs. Chen's window. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of revenge. "Then let's use that confidence against them," she said, her teacher's voice returning. "Every student has to learn sometime that actions have consequences." The ladies spent the next hour plotting, their combined centuries of experience forming a plan that would make a military strategist proud. Dorothy knew the banking system's weak points. Regina understood paper trails and documentation. Martha had connections in law enforcement. And Mrs. Chen, it turned out, had a nephew who specialized in forensic accounting. As the evening wound down, Eleanor looked at her friends, her real family, and felt hope for the first time since her world collapsed. Alex thought they were dealing with a helpless grandmother. Instead, they had awakened a team of retired professionals with nothing to lose and a score to settle. "Remember," Eleanor said as the group prepared to leave, "Alex isn't just stealing from me, they're stealing from every elderly person who trusts their family. This isn't just about revenge, it's about justice." The others nodded solemnly. The game was about to begin, and this time grandmother wasn't going to lose. Something precious, a safe haven to think. Her neighbor had insisted Eleanor move in temporarily, refusing to take no for an answer. "My mother always said, in crisis, family helps family. And sometimes neighbors are better family than blood." The bridge club gathered that evening in Mrs. Chen's living room, their usual card game forgotten. Dorothy brought her ancient leather briefcase, stuffed with notes from her 40 years in banking. Regina, a retired school administrator, arrived with a laptop and determination in her eyes. Martha, whose son was a detective, came armed with knowledge about financial fraud investigations. "First things first," Dorothy said, spreading papers across the coffee table. "We need to understand exactly what Alex did. Eleanor, show us everything you can remember signing." As Eleanor walked them through the past months, Dorothy's face grew increasingly grim. This wasn't just opportunistic theft. This was calculated, planned. Regina was scanning through Alex's social media presence on her laptop. "Look at this," she said, turning the screen. "They've been living large for months. Designer clothes, exotic trips, expensive restaurants. But their business's public records show modest success at best. Where was this money coming from even before?" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Eleanor understood. Alex had been stealing from her long before the final betrayal. "There's more," Martha added, her detective's daughter instincts kicking. I've been making calls. Alex has done this before. 3 other elderly relatives in different states, all convinced to sign over assets, all too ashamed to press charges. They're probably counting on you doing the same, Eleanor. The revelation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She wasn't just a victim of opportunity. She was part of a pattern. Her special grandchild, the one she'd loved and supported, was a practiced predator. Something cold and hard crystallized in her chest. Mrs. Chen returned from the kitchen with a fresh pot of tea and her iPad. "Look what I found," she said, pulling up a social media post. It was Alex, standing in front of a new office building. "Just closed the deal on my new investment property. Dream big." The date stamp made Eleanor's blood run cold. It was her building. Alex had used her stolen money to buy a commercial property and was bragging about it online. "They're not even trying to hide it," Dorothy muttered, her banker's mind already calculating. "This is their weakness. They think they're untouchable, that no one will believe a confused old lady over a successful young business person." Eleanor's team came together like pieces of a well-worn puzzle over the next week. Dorothy's first call was to Rita Gonzalez, a retired detective who had specialized in financial crimes. They'd crossed paths numerous times during Rita's investigations of bank fraud, building a friendship over coffee and case files. Rita arrived at Mrs. Chen's house on a Tuesday morning, her silver hair tied back in a neat bun, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She listened to Eleanor's story with the practiced patience of someone who had heard thousands of testimonies, her dark eyes missing nothing. "Classic elder abuse pattern," Rita said when Eleanor finished, pulling out a small notebook. "But they made mistakes. They always do. Overconfidence is predictable in perpetrators who target family members." She began writing, her handwriting precise and methodical. "First, we document everything. Then we follow the money." George Sullivan joined them that afternoon. He had been Dorothy's colleague at the bank, retiring as a regional manager after 35 years. His expertise was in tracking complex financial transactions, and his memory for banking regulations was legendary. "The thing about modern banking," George explained, spreading printouts across Mrs. Chen's dining table, "is that every transaction leaves a digital fingerprint. Alex may have your signatures, but they've created a trail. We just need to connect the dots." His arthritis-gnarled fingers traced patterns through the paperwork with surprising agility. Sarah Kim, a semi-retired real estate attorney, arrived. Last, Martha had worked with her on the school board, where Sarah's reputation for finding legal loopholes was both admired and feared. She reviewed the property sale documents with growing interest. "There are irregularities here," Sarah said, adjusting her designer glasses. "The timing of the transfers, the way the property was valued. Alex was rushing. When people rush, they make mistakes." She pulled out her phone, sending rapid-fire texts to contacts in the county clerk's office. As Eleanor watched her team work, she felt a surge of pride. Society might dismiss them as just another group of retirees, but between them they had over 2 centuries of professional experience. More importantly, they had something Alex didn't: patience, wisdom, and nothing left to lose. Mrs. Chen set up a makeshift command center in her basement, complete with a large whiteboard for tracking leads. Rita began mapping Alex's known activities, creating a timeline that stretched back further than Eleanor had imagined. George started untangling the web of financial transactions, his banking expertise revealing patterns that would have escaped less experienced eyes. Sarah discovered that Alex had used similar tactics before, but with a crucial difference. "They're getting bolder," she explained, pointing to documentation of previous cases. "The amounts are getting larger, the schemes more complex. Classic escalation pattern." Her legal pad was filled with notes, each page representing another crack in Alex's facade. The team worked with the quiet efficiency of people who had spent lifetimes mastering their crafts. They didn't need fancy technology or complex algorithms. They had something better. They understood how systems really worked, how people really thought, and where to look for the kind of mistakes that overconfident youngsters always made. Eleanor moved between them, absorbing every detail, her teacher's mind organizing and connecting information. She wasn't just gathering evidence, she was building an arsenal. Every document, every transaction, every social media post would become a weapon in her campaign for justice. As the sun set on their first full day of investigation, Eleanor looked at her assembled team. The detective, the banker, the lawyer, the administrator, and her faithful friend, Mrs. Chen. Alex had an expensive education and modern technology. But Eleanor had something far more valuable, a lifetime of connections and a team that understood that justice wasn't just about laws, but about righting wrongs that the system sometimes missed. "Tomorrow," Rita announced, capping her pen, "we start surveillance. Alex thinks they're untouchable. Let's show them what happens when they underestimate the old guard." The first victory came on a Wednesday morning. George Sullivan sat at Mrs. Chen's kitchen table, poring over bank statements, when his weathered face broke into a smile. "Got you," he whispered, reaching for his phone to call Dorothy. Within an hour, the team had assembled around him. "See this series of transfers?" George pointed to a sequence of transactions. Alex got cocky. "They moved your money through 3 different accounts before consolidating it into their investment fund. But they used the same routing number pattern each time." He showed them a spreadsheet where he'd mapped out the transactions. "It's like they signed their name to every theft." Rita was already making notes. "This is exactly the kind of pattern we used to look for in fraud cases. Alex probably thought they were being clever, but they just created more evidence." She pulled out her phone, showing them a series of photos. "And look what my old partner caught on surveillance." The images showed Alex meeting with other well-dressed young professionals outside various retirement communities. "They're working with a network," Rita explained. "Each person specializes in a different part of the scheme. One handles legal documents, another manages real estate, a third deals with banking. But Alex is the linchpin. They find the victims and coordinate everything." Sarah had been quiet, but now she spoke up. "I found something else. Those other elderly victims we identified. Their properties were all sold to the same development company, Sunrise Future Living LLC. Guess who's listed as a silent partner?" She passed around corporate registration documents showing Alex's name buried in the fine print. Eleanor felt her hands shake as she read the papers. "How many others?" she asked quietly. "How many other families have they destroyed?" "We've identified 7 so far," Regina said, looking up from her laptop, "all following the same pattern, all involving elderly victims who trusted their relatives. The total amount," she paused, double-checking her figures, "is close to $5 million. Mrs. Chen's nephew, Kevin, had been analyzing the financial records remotely. His email arrived with a detailed forensic accounting report. "The money isn't just sitting in accounts," he wrote. "It's being actively invested in real estate developments. They're using the stolen funds to build retirement communities, probably to find more victims." It was almost too perfect. Alex wasn't just stealing from the elderly. They were using that money to create spaces where they could find more targets. The symmetry of it would have been beautiful if it wasn't so horrifying. "But here's their weakness," Dorothy said, tapping the financial reports. "All of these transactions are linked. If one falls, they all fall. And thanks to their careful record-keeping, meant to fool auditors, we have a paper trail for everything." Eleanor's first real smile in weeks spread across her face. "So what's our next move?" Rita laid out a plan that would have made her old detective squad proud. "First, we freeze the assets. Sarah's found enough irregularities in the property transfers to file for an emergency injunction. That'll lock everything down while we build the rest of the case. Meanwhile," George added, "I still have friends at the bank. Once we show them this pattern of suspicious transactions, they'll have to launch an internal investigation. That'll tie up Alex's access to the funds. And I've got something special, Regina said with a grim smile. Alex has been bragging on social media about their success. Every post, every photo of their luxury purchases, every business announcement, it all matches perfectly with the dates of the stolen money transfers. They documented their own crimes for us. The team worked late into the night, preparing documents and coordinating their moves. Eleanor watched them with growing confidence. Alex had built their scheme on the assumption that their victims would be too ashamed or confused to fight back. They never expected to face a team of seasoned professionals who had spent decades learning how systems really worked. Tomorrow morning, Rita announced as they finally prepared to call it a night, we start freezing accounts. By the time Alex realizes what's happening, it'll be too late to hide anything. She turned to Eleanor with a fierce smile. Ready to teach your grandchild their final lesson? Eleanor nodded, thinking of all the other families who had been devastated by Alex's scheme. Time to show them that some old dogs don't just know old tricks, they know all the tricks. The first sign that their plan was working came at 8:47 a.m., when Alex's panicked voice filled Mrs. Chen's answering machine. Grandma, what did you do? The bank's frozen everything. They're saying there's an investigation. You need to call them right now and tell them this is all a mistake. Eleanor sat calmly at the kitchen table, letting the message play out while Dorothy smiled like a chess master watching a trapped opponent. 3 more calls followed in quick succession, each more desperate than the last. By the 4th call, Alex's polished business voice had cracked completely. They're already trying to move money between accounts, George reported, watching his laptop screen where his banking contacts were sending him real-time updates, hitting all their backup accounts at once. But we've flagged every transaction, a pattern they've ever used. They're just leaving more evidence. Rita's police scanner crackled with activity. Her former partner had quietly put out an alert about potential financial fraud, and patrol cars were now parked near all of Alex's known properties. They're running scared, Rita observed. Made 3 trips to different banks in the last hour. That's exactly what we want. Let them scramble. Sarah's phone buzzed with news from the courthouse. Emergency injunction granted, she announced triumphantly. Every property transaction they've made in the last year is now under review. And look who just got served with papers. She held up her phone, showing a courthouse security photo of a very shocked-looking Mr. Peterson being handed legal documents. The media was starting to sniff around too. Regina's contacts at the local newspaper had picked up on the pattern of suspicious real estate deals. They're not using any names yet, she said, but they're asking the right questions. Alex's whole successful young entrepreneur image is about to take a hit. Eleanor watched the chaos unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Part of her still ached for the grandchild she had loved, but that person was gone, if they had ever really existed. The Alex sending increasingly frantic messages was a stranger, a predator who had finally met their match. Mrs. Chen monitored social media, where Alex's carefully curated image was beginning to crack. Look, she said, turning her iPad around. They're deleting posts about their luxury purchases, but we have screenshots of everything. Even their business partners are starting to ask questions online. The team had expected retaliation, and it came swiftly. First, a call to Adult Protective Services claiming Eleanor was suffering from dementia, but Rita's police contacts intercepted that quickly. Eleanor's recent detailed statements to investigators had already established her sharp mental state. Then came the PR offensive. Alex posted a long statement about helping confused elderly relatives manage their assets and ungrateful family members misunderstanding good intentions. But Dorothy's careful documentation of the money trail told a different story, one that was already circulating among banking regulators. They're trying to access the offshore accounts now, George reported late in the afternoon. But we've got those monitored too. Every move they make just adds another layer to our case. His eyes twinkled. You know what they say about digging holes. Eleanor sat quietly through it all, reading each desperate message from Alex, watching each panicked countermove fail. She thought about all the other elderly victims who hadn't had a team like hers, who had suffered in silence. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about all of them. As evening fell, Rita gathered everyone around the kitchen table. "Tomorrow's going to be crucial," she said. "They're going to get desperate. They might try something big. But remember," she smiled grimly, "desperate people make mistakes, and we're ready for anything they throw at us." Eleanor nodded, thinking of her classroom days. Some lessons were harder than others, but they all had to be taught. And this lesson was long overdue. By the third day of their offensive, Mrs. Chen's basement had transformed into a war room. Multiple whiteboards tracked Alex's increasingly erratic movements, while printouts and documents covered every available surface. The team had settled into a rhythm, each member playing their part in an elaborate dance of justice. Rita's police contacts reported that Alex had been spotted meeting with their associates in a series of increasingly urgent gatherings. "They're turning on each other," Rita said, updating her timeline. One of Alex's partners was seen leaving Mr. Peterson's office in tears. The whole network is starting to unravel. Dorothy's banking connections were proving invaluable. "They tried to liquidate 3 investment accounts this morning," she reported, "but the compliance department flagged everything. Every transaction now requires extra scrutiny. They can't move a penny without us knowing." Sarah had been coordinating with other victims' families, carefully building a network of witnesses. "2 more families have come forward," she announced, adding pins to their evidence board. They were too afraid before, but now that they see someone fighting back, she smiled at Eleanor. "You've given them courage." George's analysis had revealed an unexpected pattern in Alex's business dealings. They've been using the stolen money to secure loans for their real estate projects, he explained. Now that the original funds are frozen, those loans are at risk. Their whole house of cards is wobbling. Mrs. Chen's nephew had discovered something even more damaging. The retirement communities they were building, Kevin's email revealed, were never meant to be completed. They were shell projects designed to attract more investors whose money would be siphoned off. Classic Ponzi scheme structure. Eleanor watched it all unfold with a teacher's satisfaction. Every revelation was another thread in their web, another lesson in their curriculum of consequences. Alex's carefully constructed world was being dismantled piece by piece, not with violence or threats, but with the patient expertise of people they had dismissed as too old to matter. Regina monitored the digital fallout. Alex's business reputation was crumbling as questions about their practices spread through professional networks. "Their speaking engagement at the Young Entrepreneurs Conference has been cancelled," she reported with satisfaction. Apparently, fraud allegations don't align with the conference's values. The team had expected Alex to fight back, but their opponent's desperation was making them predictable. Each attempt to rescue their scheme just led them deeper into the trap. When they tried to pressure other elderly clients into providing character references, those clients called Sarah instead. When they attempted to destroy records, George's banking contacts had already secured copies. "Look at this," Mrs. Chen called out, holding up her iPad. Alex's latest social media post was a desperate attempt at damage control. Disappointed by false accusations from those who misunderstand modern business practices, truth will prevail. The comments section was filled with skeptical responses from former business associates distancing themselves from the scandal. Eleanor's other children had finally started calling too, their voices uncertain as they confronted the truth about Alex. "Mom, we had no idea," Michael had said that morning. "We should have listened when you tried to tell us." Eleanor's forgiveness would come later. For now, she had them gathering evidence of Alex's earlier manipulations. As evening approached, Rita gathered the team for their daily strategy session. "Tomorrow's the key," she said, pointing to their timeline. "Alex has a meeting with their investors when they can't explain the frozen assets." She let the implication hang in the air. "Their whole facade is about to crumble," Dorothy added. "Every lie, every theft, every manipulation. It's all documented and ready to be exposed." Eleanor sat in her usual spot, Howard's old cardigan wrapped around her shoulders. She thought about Alex's childhood visits, the cookies they'd baked, the dreams they'd shared. Somewhere along the way, her beloved grandchild had chosen greed over love, cunning over kindness. Tomorrow would be hard, but necessary. "Remember," she told her team, her teacher's voice gentle but firm, "this isn't about revenge anymore. It's about protection. Every elderly person who might have been their next victim, every family that might have been torn apart. We're doing this for them too." The others nodded solemnly. Their web was set, its threads invisible but unbreakable. Alex had thought they were the spider, but they were about to learn what it meant to be the fly. The morning of the investor meeting dawned bright and clear, but Alex's world was about to turn very dark. Eleanor and her team gathered early at Mrs. Chen's house, watching events unfold through their carefully placed network of informants. "First, dominoes about to fall," Rita announced, hanging up her phone. "The State Banking Commission just opened a formal investigation into all of Alex's business dealings. They're serving papers at the investor meeting." She checked her watch. Right about now, George's laptop pinged with updates from his banking contacts. "Multiple accounts frozen across 3 states, he reported, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "They're shutting down every financial avenue Alex ever used. Even their personal accounts are locked for investigation." Sarah had been working through the night, coordinating with other victims' lawyers. "We've got sworn statements from 5 of the families," she said, adding documents to their evidence pile, all describing the exact same pattern of manipulation and theft. The district attorney's office is very interested. The investor meeting was turning into exactly the disaster they'd planned for. Regina's business contacts were sending live updates. Alex had walked into the conference room confident, only to find not just their nervous investors, but also banking regulators and fraud investigators waiting. "They tried to run," Mrs. Chen reported, reading messages from her nephew who worked in the building. Security stopped them at the garage entrance. Apparently, they had a packed suitcase in their car trunk. She shook her head. "Always running, these young ones. Never learning to face consequences." Dorothy's phone buzzed with news from the bank's legal department. "The forensic accountants have finished their preliminary review," she announced. "They've found evidence of systematic fraud going back 3 years. Every transaction, every transfer, it's all documented." Eleanor sat quietly through it all, grading papers to keep her hands busy. Old habits die hard. Each new revelation was like a test score, adding up to a final grade that Alex had earned through their own choices. The student had finally failed the teacher. The media arrived at Alex's office building around noon. Someone, Rita wouldn't say who, had tipped them off about the fraud investigation. Cameras caught Alex being escorted out, their designer suit wrinkled, their carefully maintained image crumbling in real time. "Look at this," Regina called out, turning her laptop around. The business news websites were running headlines: "Rising star or elaborate fraud. Young entrepreneur faces multiple investigations." Alex's photo, once featured in 30 under 30 lists, now illustrated articles about financial crimes. Mr. Peterson, Alex's lawyer, had already jumped ship. Sarah's legal contacts reported he was cooperating with investigators, trading information for leniency. "He's given them everything," Sarah said, a satisfied smile on her face. "Every document, every conversation, every scheme they planned together." By mid-afternoon, the scope of their victory was becoming clear. The emergency injunction had been upgraded to a full asset freeze. The retirement community projects were shut down pending investigation. Alex's business partners were falling over themselves to make deals with prosecutors. Eleanor's other children called again, this time with determination in their voices. They'd seen the news, understood finally what their mother had been trying to tell them. "We're going to make this right, Mom," Michael promised. "Whatever it takes." Mrs. Chen brought out a special tea she'd been saving. "In China," she said. As she poured, "we have a saying, 'Justice may be slow, but it grinds exceedingly fine.'" She handed Eleanor a cup. "You have ground very fine indeed." The team gathered around Mrs. Chen's dining room table, watching the sun set on Alex's empire. Their meticulous planning, their careful coordination, their decades of combined experience, it had all come together perfectly. The student who thought they could outsmart their elders had learned a costly lesson. There's still work to do. Rita reminded them, ever the detective. Statements to give, evidence to process, legal proceedings to follow through. She looked at Eleanor with respect. "But the hard part's done. They'll never hurt another family like this again." Eleanor nodded, thinking of all the other elderly victims who would now see justice. Alex had thought age meant weakness, that wisdom could be outmaneuvered by cunning. Instead, they'd learned that some lessons can only be taught by those who've lived long enough to truly understand justice. "Tomorrow," Eleanor said, lifting her teacup in a toast, "we start helping the other families recover what they lost." Her team, her true family, raised their cups in response. The tables hadn't just turned, they'd been flipped entirely, and the game would never be the same again. The breakthrough came at midnight. Kevin, Mrs. Chen's nephew, sent an urgent email that had the entire team rushing back to their war room, even at that late hour. His forensic analysis had uncovered something none of them had expected, a connection that changed everything. "Look at this," he wrote, attaching documents that showed a complex web of shell companies. "Alex isn't the mastermind. They're just one part of a national network. Someone's been coordinating similar schemes across the country." Rita spread the documents across the table, her detective instincts firing on all cylinders. "These signatures keep repeating. Different company names, different states, but the same people behind it all." She pointed to a recurring name. "Sebastian Wade, CEO of Senior Futures Investment Group." George's face went pale as he recognized the name. Wade was a legend in banking circles. He specialized in retirement investment funds, built a reputation for helping seniors manage their estates. He shook his head in disgust. He was recruiting people like Alex, training them to target their own families. Sarah was already diving into legal databases. Wade's company has been involved in dozens of elder care developments nationwide. But look at the pattern. Every project starts with local families being defrauded, then the money gets laundered through these construction projects that never finish. The scope of the conspiracy stunned Eleanor. Alex wasn't just a greedy grandchild. They were a trained predator, part of a systematic operation targeting elderly victims across America. Her personal betrayal was just one thread in a massive tapestry of fraud. Dorothy's banking contacts confirmed the worst. Wade's organization has been doing this for years. They find young, ambitious people with elderly relatives, promise them wealth and success, then teach them how to exploit their own families. Her voice cracked with anger. They turn family members into weapons. Mrs. Chen, who had been quietly making calls to her extensive network of friends in other cities, reported similar stories emerging everywhere. "Each city has an Alex," she said softly. "Each family has their own betrayal. But now we see the puppet master." The revelation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Her quest for justice had suddenly expanded far beyond her personal vendetta. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was uncovering a nationwide crime ring that had turned family betrayal into a business model. Rita's police contacts were already mobilizing. "FBI's been looking for a pattern like this," she revealed. "They just needed someone to connect the dots. Wade thought he was invisible, operating through people like Alex. But he never counted on us. The team worked through the night, their mission transforming with each new piece of evidence. They weren't just taking down Alex anymore. They were unraveling an entire criminal enterprise that had weaponized family trust." As dawn broke, Eleanor stood at Mrs. Chen's window, watching the sunrise. What had started as a grandmother's revenge had become something much bigger. Wade and his organization had spent years exploiting the elderly, turning their twilight years into nightmares of betrayal. "Well," she said, turning back to her team, "I guess we're not done teaching lessons after all." The dominoes began to fall faster than anyone expected. Alex, facing multiple federal charges and the collapse of their empire, finally broke. In exchange for leniency, they gave up everything they knew about Wade's operation, triggering a chain reaction that rocked the eldercare industry nationwide. "Wade's trying to evacuate his offices," Rita reported, hanging up with her FBI contact. "But we've got people waiting at every exit. His private jet's been grounded, his accounts frozen. He's trapped, and he knows it." She smiled grimly. "Just like he trapped so many families." Dorothy's banking network lit up with alerts as financial institutions across the country began flagging suspicious transactions linked to Senior Futures Investment Group. "They're all panicking," she said, watching the updates roll in. "Every crooked advisor, every compromised manager, they're all running for cover." Sarah had coordinated with a network of elder law attorneys in 12 states. "Class action lawsuits are being filed simultaneously," she announced. "Hundreds of families coming forward. The evidence is overwhelming." She held up a thick folder. Wade's own training materials prove they deliberately targeted vulnerable seniors. George's analysis of the money trail had revealed the full scope of Wade's operation. "Over $50 million stolen from elderly victims," he reported quietly. "All funneled through fake development projects, all stolen from people who trusted their families." Mrs. Chen's social network had become an intelligence hub, with seniors across the country sharing stories and evidence. "They thought we were isolated," she said, scrolling through messages on her iPad. "They forgot that old people talk to each other." The media coverage exploded. What had started as a local story about Eleanor and Alex had become national news. "Elder Care Empire Revealed." As massive fraud rings, screamed the headlines. Pictures of Wade being escorted from his office in handcuffs played on every news channel. Alex's former associates were turning on each other, each trying to save themselves. Mr. Peterson had provided prosecutors with recordings of training sessions, where Wade taught his recruits how to manipulate their elderly relatives. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. Eleanor watched it all unfold from Mrs. Chen's living room, her teacher's heart both satisfied and saddened. The lesson had been taught, but at what cost? How many families had been destroyed before justice finally caught up? "Wade's asking to make a deal," Rita announced late that evening. "But the prosecutors aren't interested. They've got everything they need from Alex and the others. He's going to face every charge, every victim, every betrayal." The perfect storm they'd created had grown beyond anything they'd imagined. What began as one grandmother's quest for justice had exposed a nationwide criminal enterprise and given voice to hundreds of victims who'd suffered in silence. As the team gathered for their evening update, Eleanor raised her teacup in a quiet toast. "To justice," she said simply, "and to remembering that wisdom doesn't come with an expiration date." The federal courthouse buzzed with activity as Eleanor and her team arrived for the preliminary hearings. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. Inside, the marble halls echoed with whispers and hurried footsteps as lawyers, investigators, and victims' families gathered for what the media had dubbed the Grey Justice Trials. "Wade's lawyers are trying one last maneuver," Sarah reported, scanning through documents on her tablet. "They're claiming he was unaware of his employees' actions, that people like Alex acted independently." She smiled tightly. "But we've got the training videos, every session, every instruction on how to manipulate elderly relatives. He can't distance himself from this." Dorothy had spent the previous night organizing testimony from bank employees across the country. 23 bank managers ready to testify about how Wade's organization pressured them to overlook suspicious transactions. She adjusted her reading glasses. They're not just facing criminal charges now. The banking regulators are going to tear their entire operation apart. Rita's police contacts had coordinated with FBI agents to ensure every piece of evidence was properly documented. "We've got a complete timeline," she said, spreading papers across the courthouse cafe table. "Every fraud, every theft, every manipulation. From Wade's first scheme 10 years ago right up to Alex's operation. It's bulletproof." George's financial forensics had revealed the true extent of Wade's empire. "The money trail goes through 6 countries and dozens of shell companies," he explained, pointing to complex diagrams. "But every path leads back to Wade. He thought he was clever, using family members as fronts for his schemes. Instead, he created a network of witnesses who can testify against him." Mrs. Chen had organized a support network for the victims' families, turning the courthouse cafeteria into a command center of sorts. Elderly victims from across the country shared their stories, each one strengthening the case against Wade and his organization. "They thought age made us weak," she said, pouring tea for a group of newly arrived families. "Instead, it made us wise enough to recognize the pattern." Regina monitored the media coverage, ensuring the true story reached the public. "Every major network is covering this," she reported. "They're calling it the largest elder fraud scheme in history. Wade's reputation is destroyed. Even if he somehow avoided jail, he'll never be able to do this again." Eleanor watched a group of elderly victims hugging their families, tears of relief streaming down their faces as they realized they weren't alone, weren't at fault, weren't foolish for trusting their loved ones. She thought of Alex, now sitting in a holding cell, preparing to testify against Wade. The grandchild she'd loved was still in there somewhere, buried under layers of greed and manipulation. "Your testimony is scheduled for tomorrow morning," Rita reminded Eleanor gently. "Are you ready?" Eleanor nodded, feeling the weight of all those other families' hopes resting on her shoulders. Her story would be the first, setting the stage for dozens of others to follow. "The prosecutors say we've got them cornered," Sarah added, returning from a meeting with the district attorney. "Wade's lawyers are already talking plea bargain, but the DA isn't interested. They want this to go to trial. They want every detail exposed, every victim heard, every betrayal brought to light." As the sun set through the courthouse windows, Eleanor gathered her team, her friends, her defenders, her Justice League of Retirees, for a final strategy session. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of the end, the culmination of their careful planning and relentless pursuit of truth. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she told them, her teacher's voice steady and sure, "we've already won the most important battle. We've shown that age doesn't mean helplessness, that wisdom and experience can triumph over greed and deception." She looked around at the families gathering in the cafeteria, at the networks of support and strength they'd built together. "We've taught them all that the elderly aren't easy targets. We're forces to be reckoned with." The team nodded, each member ready for their part in tomorrow's proceedings. The trap was set, the evidence was ironclad, and justice was finally within reach. Wade had built an empire on stolen trust, but he was about to learn that some things, like wisdom, determination, and the bonds of true family, couldn't be stolen or corrupted. The courtroom fell silent as Eleanor Thompson took the witness stand. Her steps were steady, her spine straight, her eyes fixed firmly ahead. Behind her, the gallery was packed with victims' families, reporters, and curious onlookers. Sebastian, Wade, sat at the defense table, his expensive suit unable to hide the nervous twitch in his jaw. "Please state your name for the record," the prosecutor began. "Eleanor Marie Thompson," she replied, her teacher's voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. As she began recounting her story, the years of trust, the careful manipulation, the devastating betrayal, Wade's composed facade began to crack. Alex was brought in next, now wearing prison orange instead of designer suits. They couldn't meet Eleanor's eyes as they detailed Wade's training programs. "He taught us how to target our own families," Alex testified, their voice barely above a whisper. "How to exploit their trust, manipulate their emotions, steal their lives piece by piece." The evidence mounted like an unstoppable tide. Dorothy presented the financial records, each transaction a damning piece of the puzzle. George explained the money laundering scheme in terms so clear that even the most complex fraud became obvious. Rita's law enforcement connections provided surveillance footage of Wade's training sessions. "And what did Mr. Wade say about elderly victims?" the prosecutor asked Alex. "He said—" Alex paused, swallowing hard. "He said they were perfect targets because their age made them invisible, that nobody would believe them over their successful young relatives." Tears rolled down Alex's cheeks. "He taught us to weaponize their love against them." Wade's legal team tried to maintain control, but Sarah had prepared for every objection, every attempt to discredit the victims. Mrs. Chen's network of families provided witness after witness, each story building on the last, creating a devastating picture of systematic exploitation. The turning point came when Regina presented the social media evidence, hundreds of posts from Wade's recruits bragging about their sudden wealth, their luxury purchases, their business success. Each post was time-stamped to match exactly with thefts from elderly victims. Eleanor watched it all from her seat beside Mrs. Chen, her hand clasped tightly in her friend's. She saw Wade's expression change as he realized the full scope of the evidence against him, saw the moment he understood that his empire of elder abuse was crumbling beyond repair. "Your Honor," Wade's lawyer stood suddenly. "My client would like to change his plea, but the prosecutor, backed by hundreds of victims, and their families, wasn't interested in deals anymore. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about exposing the full scope of elder exploitation, about showing the world that age didn't equal vulnerability." As the day drew to a close, the judge called a brief recess. In the courthouse hallway, Eleanor found herself surrounded by other elderly victims, all sharing stories of betrayal and resilience. They weren't just witnesses anymore. They were warriors, each one standing tall against those who had tried to render them invisible. "You did it, Grandma," Alex said quietly, being led past her in handcuffs. "You beat us all." Eleanor looked at her grandchild, seeing both the person they had been and the criminal they had become. "No, Alex," she replied softly. "You beat yourself. I just refused to be invisible." Outside, the setting sun painted the courthouse steps in shades of gold. Tomorrow would bring the verdict, but the real victory had already been won. Wade's organization was exposed, his methods revealed, his power broken. More importantly, hundreds of elderly victims had found their voices, their strength, their justice. Eleanor's team gathered around her, these retired professionals who had become her strongest allies. Together, they had proven that wisdom didn't diminish with age. It only grew sharper, more powerful, more dangerous to those who would dare to underestimate it. The verdict came down on a Thursday morning. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with an overflow room set up downstairs to accommodate all the families who had come to witness justice being served. Eleanor sat in the front row, surrounded by her team, her hands folded calmly in her lap as the jury foreman stood. "In the matter of the United States versus Sebastian Wade, on the count of conspiracy to commit elder fraud, we find the defendant guilty." The foreman's voice grew stronger with each count. "On the count of money laundering, guilty. On the count of operating a criminal enterprise, guilty." The list went on, each guilty, another nail in the coffin of Wade's criminal empire. Wade's face, once smugly confident, had turned ashen. His expensive legal team sat motionless, their legal maneuvers and tactical delays finally exhausted. Behind them, Alex and the other cooperative witnesses watched from a secured area, their testimony having helped seal their former mentor's fate. The judge's sentencing statement was scathing. Mr. Wade, you have orchestrated one of the most despicable schemes this court has ever encountered. You didn't just steal money, you stole trust, dignity, and family bonds. You turned children against their parents, grandchildren against their grandparents. You weaponized love itself for profit. The sentence was unprecedented. 30 years in federal prison, forfeiture of all assets, and restitution to the victims. The judge added special provisions requiring all seized assets to be used first for elderly victim support services. Wade's empire wouldn't just be dismantled, it would be transformed into a shield protecting future potential victims. As Wade was led away in handcuffs, Eleanor felt no satisfaction in his defeat. Instead, she watched the families around her. Elderly parents embracing their repentant children, grandparents wiping away tears of relief, victims who had felt shame now standing tall with vindication. The press conference afterward was Dorothy's idea. This isn't just about punishment, she had insisted. It's about prevention. One by one, victims stepped forward to tell their stories. Eleanor went last, her teacher's voice steady and clear. "We are not invisible," she declared, cameras flashing around her. "We are not weak. We are not easy targets. We are living libraries of experience, and today we have taught a powerful lesson about justice." The courthouse steps erupted in applause. Back in the prosecution's office, the asset recovery team presented their findings. Wade's organization had stolen over $50 million, but their careful financial tracking had located most of it. George's banking expertise had been crucial in untangling the complex web of transactions. "The restitution process will take a time," Sarah explained to the gathered victims, "but we've already secured the assets. Every victim will receive full compensation, plus damages." She smiled at Eleanor. "Starting with your house." The paperwork to void the fraudulent sale of Eleanor's home had already been prepared. Rita's police contacts had fast-tracked the process, ensuring Eleanor wouldn't lose another day of her life to Wade's schemes. Mrs. Chen had kept the garden tended, refusing to let Eleanor's roses die while justice took its course. Alex's sentencing was a separate matter. In exchange for their cooperation, they received a reduced sentence of 5 years, plus mandatory counseling and community service working with elderly fraud prevention programs. When they stood to hear their sentence, they finally met Eleanor's eyes. "Grandma," they began, voice cracking, "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know you taught me more in defeat than Wade ever taught me in victory. I thought I was so smart, so sophisticated, but you showed me what real wisdom looks like." Eleanor's response was measured, heavy with both love and pain. "Alex, you chose money over family, greed over love. That's a lesson you'll have to live with, but when you're ready to learn a different way of living, if you're truly ready to change, I'll be here." The aftermath of the trial brought a wave of reform. Banks implemented new protections for elderly clients. Law enforcement created specialized units for elder fraud. Support groups sprang up nationwide, using Eleanor's story as a blueprint for fighting back against financial exploitation. Regina coordinated with media outlets to share prevention strategies. George worked with banking associations to develop new security protocols. Rita helped train police departments in recognizing signs of elder fraud. Sarah drafted proposed legislation, strengthening protections for elderly assets. Mrs. Chen's network of senior citizens became a powerful advocacy group, their voices now commanding attention in community meetings and legislative sessions. The invisible had become invincible, their age transformed from liability to asset. Eleanor's Bridge Club resumed their weekly games, but their conversations now went far beyond cards. They had become unofficial counselors to other elderly victims, sharing their experience and strength. Their quiet afternoon games had become strategy sessions for a continuing revolution in elder rights. As Eleanor finally returned to her beloved Victorian home, she found her garden blooming despite the months of absence. Mrs. Chen had not only tended the roses, but had planted new ones of variety called survivor's glory. The metaphor wasn't lost on either of them. The grandfather clock in the hallway still kept perfect time, its steady ticking a reminder that some things, like justice, wisdom, and the strength of the human spirit, were timeless. Eleanor stood in her living room, surrounded by the photos and memories of a life well lived, and felt not like a victim who had won, but like a teacher who had successfully imparted the most important lesson of all. Never underestimate those who have spent a lifetime learning how to stand strong. 1 year later, Eleanor's garden hosted a very different kind of gathering. Where once she had faced betrayal and loss, now her Victorian home's wraparound porch was filled with champions of elder justice. Her bridge club ladies, once just weekly card players, had become the founding members of the Senior Rights Protection Network, a nationwide organization helping elderly victims fight back against financial abuse. Mrs. Chen's roses bloomed alongside Eleanor's, their gardens now merged into one spectacular display that attracted admiring looks from passers-by. The two women spent their mornings tending to the flowers and their afternoons counseling other seniors through their network of support groups. Their friendship, forged in crisis, had blossomed into an unshakable bond. Dorothy had retired from her banking work only to begin a new career teaching financial literacy to seniors. Rita's police contacts had evolved into a formal task force specializing in elder fraud prevention. Sarah's legal practice now focused exclusively on protecting elderly clients, with George serving as her financial expert witness. Eleanor still received letters from Alex, each one showing small steps toward redemption. She answered them all, not with the blind trust of before, but with the measured wisdom of someone who understood that true change required both accountability and hope. The grandfather clock still chimed the hours in Eleanor's hallway, but its sound no longer marked time passing. Instead, it became a reminder of persistence, of justice, and of the power of those who refuse to be silenced by age or circumstance. On this particular afternoon, as Eleanor watched her extended family of fighters and survivors share stories on her porch, she realized that what had started as one grandmother's quest for revenge had grown into something far more powerful, a movement that proved wisdom wasn't just about surviving time, but about using it to create lasting change. "More tea?" Mrs. Chen asked, appearing at her side with a fresh pot. Eleanor smiled, watching a new group of elderly visitors climbing her porch steps, seeking guidance and finding strength. "Yes," she said, "we have work to do."